Okay, so our next unit is going to cover land use. So these are chapters 10, 12, and 13. So we're going to start out with agricultural land use, and then we're going to talk about forest management, and finally we'll finish off talking about cities and some of the issues that are involved in our urban environment. Okay, so I thought this was a nice map to kind of start out with because it shows the various land use in the United States. And we can see from this, if you look at the yellow and the brown portion, that a large part of our land use is dedicated to pasture and rangeland and cropland. So in fact, 1/3 of U.S. land is used for pasture, and about 1/5 of the country is used for agricultural purposes. Now, of that 1/5, right, it's actually a smaller percentage of that that's actually used for food. So some of the agricultural land, for instance, is used to raise feed for livestock. And about 1/3 of our corn production is used actually for ethanol production. So you may realize that ethanol gets added to gasoline. That helps to basically reduce our usage of fossil fuels, and it reduces some of the pollution issues. We'll talk about that in our next units or two. Okay, so some of the things to think about as we talk about the various issues surrounding agriculture is to keep in mind how complex some of these issues are. So we're going to kind of go over and over again the advantages and disadvantages of all the various practices. So there really are no easy answers. We're weighing a lot of different concerns as we talk about various agricultural practices. So for example, these are 3 things that we're going to talk a lot about. So we're going to start out talking about conventional agriculture. So this is very high yield, but high input agriculture. This is what we think of when you see, the big plowing cornfields in the Midwest, right? And a lot of people think that this is really the only model that can feed the world. So we'll talk about what that means and if that, in fact, if we think that's true. Organic farming is something that's been on the increase in recent years. Certainly, if you look in the local grocery store, you'll see that the amount of organic produce has really increased. And it's generally more expensive, but it has advantages in, for instance, the pesticide use and sustainable practices. So the question for organic farmers, though, is, what is the production like? So if you can't have as high of yield, but you have better soil, that's going to then remain into the future. Is that better than high yield that may be using up all of our resources? And then finally, genetic engineering. So these are the GMOs that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about some of the issues that surround them, as well as perhaps some of the potential uses that can be found for GMOs. All right, so this graph is showing basically the reason that some of the things we've talked about in the past haven't happened. So remember Malthus, and we talked about Ehrlich and the population bomb, and their thesis was basically that as population increased, we're not going to be able to have enough resources, and that this would lead to really dire consequences. And we haven't seen that. And this is really the reason is right here in this graph that as population has increased, so has our food production. Okay, if you look at all the different categories, right, they've all been increasing at either the same rate or actually a higher rate than the population. So even though our population's increased, the amount of people with food insecurity has actually decreased. One thing I will point out here is notice the grain line. The grain line is the one area that's been kind of leveling off. So the grain production has not completely kept pace with population. And that may give us a little pause to think about, well, how far in the future can this continue? Okay, so as I said, we are producing more food per person. All right, so we've been able to outpace population growth, which is good. The bad part of this is it's really been very high input. So we've done this, we've increased our production by increasing the amount of fossil fuels that go into farming, by increasing the amount of irrigation, by increasing the amount of fertilizers and pesticides that are applied, right? By more frequent harvest and cultivating more land, okay? We'll talk about next, we've also been developing more productive crop and livestock varieties, which has helped greatly. And the cost of all this is, well, what's happened to the soil, right? We just finished that in the last unit. What are some of those soil issues? We know a little bit about what's happening, for instance, the aquifers with water, but there are other water issues we'll talk about in the next unit when we discuss water use in more detail. And biodiversity. So as we use more land, we have more biodiversity issues. So the overall question we want to think about is, can this continue? All right, and remember that grain production we just talked about is kind of our little question mark. Is that a problem that we're going to have? All right, so here are just some vocabulary that I want you to know, and especially make sure you can tell the difference between them. So undernutrition is not enough calories, okay? Overnutrition is receiving too many calories. That seems pretty easy, all right? Here's what you want to keep track of, though. Malnutrition is the failure to obtain enough of the essential nutrients, so vitamins, minerals, proteins. So it's actually possible to be malnourished, but get enough calories. So it depends what type of calories those are. So you want to keep that distinction in your mind, okay? And malnutrition, two forms that you'll run across are kwashiorkor. So this happens a lot, especially in babies that have just been weaned from milk and are eating solid food. And it's because they're not getting enough protein in their diet. So these are the pictures you always see when there's droughts, for instance, and people are not getting enough food, and the kids have really extended abdomens. And that's a result of that protein deficiency. And then marasmus is that protein deficiency, but also just not getting enough calories. All right. Sometimes this is referred to as a failure to thrive. Again, is especially noted in children. The other vocab word I want you to know on this list is food security. All right, so that's the guarantee of an adequate, safe, nutritious, and reliable food supply. So even though people may be technically getting enough food, their day-to-day existence, food is not a secure item. So for example, in the United States, we don't necessarily think about people starving or being hungry, but 31 million Americans are food insecure, where they do not have enough money to guarantee that they're going to have food for the next day. All right, so how do we increase production so fantastically? Right? And we've really sort of dubbed this increase the Green Revolution. So we've talked already about the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. Remember, those were our other places where we've seen agriculture increase. Okay, and so Green Revolution, we're now talking mid and late 20th century. So think 1940s, 50s, 60s onward. And it really is the introduction of new technology and better crop varieties. And in particular, it was introducing these technologies to the developing world to really increase their agricultural production. Okay, so one of the people that's associated with this is Norman Borlaug, and he was a U.S. agricultural scientist, and he introduced farmers in Mexico to a strain of wheat that was more resistant to drought. It was shorter in stature, so it was shorter and it could resist wind better. It didn't get blown over. It was more resistant to disease. So basically, it just grew better in the Mexican climate and produced much higher yields. So he wound up winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and that experiment then got extended to other developing nations that likewise saw a big increase in crop production. So here is a graph that's showing crop production in India. So again, we start about mid-century, so 1950 onward, and you can see at the start that they're importing some amount of food. So they're not producing enough grain for their population. And then there's this huge population increase. We've already talked about that in our population unit. But notice the production of grain also increased along with the population. So even though they saw this huge population increase, the grain production has been able to keep up. And you can see starting about 1980 that they've actually been able to acquire a buffer. So in other words, they now can store crops against maybe a bad year, and they have some excess in the system. Okay, now we still talk about, obviously there are food issues in India, but they tend to be more things with distribution or economic inequalities than they are in the fact that they just can't produce enough food. All right, so overall, again, here's our advantages and disadvantages. So advantages is reduced pressure to convert additional land for cultivation. So think about it. If you get higher crop yields from the same amount of land, that's a good thing when you're thinking about land use, right? It's more efficient. And so we've actually been able to probably not convert as much agricultural land as we would have otherwise. So we've been actually helping preserve biodiversity in that respect, okay? The disadvantages are, remember all those high inputs? So increased fossil fuels, increased pesticides, increased irrigation. So all of those things are impacting pollution, topsoil erosion, soil and water quality. All right, and those are things we're going to be dealing with in the future. Okay, and it also has managed to increase our monocultures. So when people have found these crops that work well, you now have entire fields, entire areas of the world that are planted with basically one crop. So we call that monocultures. And the disadvantage there is we're losing some of our genetic variability. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, the other thing in chapter 10 that I'm not going to go over too much here, but I want you to go and either go through your notes or go back to the chapter and review, right? This is a good chance to do a little reviewing. And it's also, since it ties into what we're talking about, it's good to have. So I want you to go back and make sure you still have this in your notes and can still answer questions about them. So go over the negative and positive impacts of pesticides. Remind yourself how pests evolve resistance to these chemicals. So understand what the evolutionary arms race is. Understand what we mean when we say pesticide treadmill. Okay, review biological control mechanisms. So remember, Rachel Carson talks about this a lot, and then there have been some particular case studies that we talked about. So review how that works and what some of the advantages and disadvantages are to biological control. All right, review IPM. Remember, that's our integrated pest management. So go over what that entails, what practices are allowed with this, what the advantages are, and then what the disadvantages are. Why isn't everybody using IPM? And then lastly, please review some of the information on pollinators. So we talked about some specific example like the monarch butterflies or honeybees and their impact on agriculture, as well as other areas of biodiversity. All right. And then the last thing, remember a couple slides ago, I think I ended off talking about monocultures. So one of the problems with monocultures, if you think about it, is it gets rid of some of our genetic diversity. So now you have crops that are literally exactly the same. So if some pest comes along or a disease, right, what's the probability that there's going to be, some individuals that have resistance to that? Well, if they all have the same genetics, then it's going to destroy the whole crop, okay? So you're losing that ability to rebound from disasters, basically. Or what happens if the climate changes and we need to develop crops that are more drought resistant or that can tolerate higher salinities in the soil, for example? Well, in order to breed better varieties, we need to have that genetic diversity there. So we want to try to come up with ways to preserve crop diversity. We also need this because consumers sort of drive these monocultures because we prefer, for instance, the shiny red apple, right? Food processors, they want fruit that's all the same size and shape, so it packs well. They want things that have a long shelf life. So those are the things we're choosing, not how nutritious it is or how well it tastes. So what can we do about this idea of monocultures? So we'll talk a little bit in the next couple slideshows about some sustainable agriculture and what impact that can make. But we also want to actually keep as much of this as we can. So people have started seed banks to maintain genetic diversity. So I think one of the videos you watched as a review talked a little bit about seed banks. So there's the Doomsday Vault in Norway is probably the most famous one. Okay, so that's it for our introduction. Our next couple lectures, we're going to talk a little bit more about genetically modified organisms, and then we'll move on and talk about livestock and rangelands and things like that. All right, so I'll see you at our next class. Have a good day.